Steph?
Leah,
Jess?
is this line secure?
Hello and welcome to Secure Line. Today we're diving into a topic that has dominated headlines and raised serious concerns about the integrity of democracy: foreign interference.
I'm Jessica Davis, president of the Canadian Association for Security and Intelligence Studies and Insight Threat Intelligence, a social enterprise focused on combating illicit finance to make the world safer and fairer for everyone.
I'm Stephanie Carvin. I'm an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, where I mostly research areas like international security, national security, and sometimes the intersection of technology in those areas.
We've all heard the buzzwords now: disinformation, covert influence, cyber operations, but what's really happening behind the scenes? In this episode, we're unpacking the latest findings from the public inquiry into foreign interference, which just released its report last week. This inquiry was launched following mounting concerns over China, Russia, and other state actors attempting to meddle in Canada's political processes. It came after a series of intelligence leaks, investigative reports, and growing political pressure, revealing that foreign governments may have targeted Canadian elections, influenced public discourse, and even established propaganda networks on Canadian soil. We'll explore what the inquiry uncovered about the challenges of balancing national security with transparency, how intelligence is collected and acted upon, and the extent to which foreign actors manipulate our democratic institutions. We'll also examine Canada's response mechanisms, from intelligence briefings to legislative reforms, and discuss which still needs to be done to protect elections, policymakers, and the public from external threats. And just to be clear, Leah West is not here with us today. She was on the Research Council of the Foreign Interference Inquiry, but she will be joining us next week.
We're going to set the scene with a little bit of context, just to remind all of our listeners about what's been happening here in Canada over the last, 2 or 3 years in terms of foreign interference. So back in 2022, 2023, reports from the Globe and Mail and Global News cited leaked intelligence from CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, indicating that China had interfered in Canada's 2019 and 2021 federal elections. Allegations included efforts to support preferred candidates, suppress votes, and fund political campaigns through covert channels. Opposition parties, particularly the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, pushed for an independent inquiry after media reports suggested that the government failed to act decisively on CSIS intelligence. Public confidence in the integrity of Canada's electoral process was shaken, leading to calls for transparency. The Liberal government initially resisted an inquiry and in 2023 appointed former Governor General David Johnston as a special rapporteur to investigate. Johnston concluded that foreign interference was a serious issue, but recommended against a public inquiry. His findings were widely criticized as inadequate, and he later resigned amid controversy. Then in April 2023, Harjit Singh Nijjar, a Canadian Sikh activist, was killed in what was widely reported as a targeted assassination by India, the ultimate form of foreign interference. Following continued political pressure, the Trudeau government agreed to establish a public inquiry into foreign interference in September 2023, led by Quebec Judge Marie-Josée Hug. The inquiry focuses on China, Russia, India, and other foreign actors, examining their influence in Canadian politics. And just for full transparency, both Steph and I were on academic roundtables at the inquiry, and you can find both of our appearances on their website. So today we're going to really reflect on the report itself.
Okay, Jess, maybe we should just start off with our first impressions of the report. Um, so I would say that let's start with the positive, right? I think one of the things is that they have clearly taken effort to make this an accessible read. I mean, you may quibble with that. You may say 800 pages is not an accessible read, but it is actually, for the readers out there, you can definitely read like the first part of even just the executive summary and get a good idea of what Justice Oak is saying in this report, right? So I think that is something to be commended. Like, making this accessible to the public, I think, is very important. The second thing is, I think the report does put some of the more controversial aspects of this particular issue. For example, the National Security Intelligence Committee Parliamentarian report, which of course was referred to the commission in the summer of last year. She talks about that pretty much immediately. She doesn't bury the lead, I think, as journalists would say. And so, she kind of puts the headlines right there. So I think that's a pretty good aspect of this as well. And finally, I don't think that I think this report will be very helpful, say, to people like you and I who like to delve into how the intelligence sausage is made, lack of a better term. I think that there is a lot, if you are curious about the intelligence and national security community, this and, of course, the inquiry that went into the Public Order Emergency Act invocation, that was a really, those two reports will give you a pretty good understanding, I think, of how the intelligence community works in Canada, or in a lot of cases doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that those are really good points. I think I want to preface my comments by saying I was never on board with an inquiry. I didn't think it was going to tell us anything all that useful. And to a certain extent, I think I'm justified in that.
Ooh.
Um, so when I was reading this, I think that this report really summarizes everything that's wrong with security intelligence in Canada, but from a foreign interference perspective. So, some highlights that we need to fix intelligence culture in Canada.
Yes.
Getting feedback, have policymakers actually read the intelligence, write it better, share it more strategically and with a wider group of people, clear more people, improve media reporting. Like, these are all things that we know and have known for many, many years. You wrote a book on it. So these are
Available
all
in all good bookstores. Intelligence and Policy Making, The Canadian Experience. Stanford
like,
University Press.
these are not surprises. Intelligence to evidence comes up a couple times. Let's all have a drink about that. Have a strategy. How many times have we talked about how the Canadian government needs strategies for foreign affairs and intelligence? Be more transparent. Tamajino is not with us today, but he would definitely have things to say about that. And finally, the last one was resource and train the RCMP properly.
Yeah.
These are all things that we've known for a decade and have done almost nothing about.
Also,
There's a
yes.
few tweaks that have happened here and there, but really, these are systemic issues that we didn't need an inquiry to find out about. That's my more cynical take on this. I think there were a couple of novel issues that did come up too, though. The emphasis on mis and disinformation I thought was fairly useful.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to dive into that.
Yeah, definitely. The duty to warn, I think, was a useful thing that was really pulled out of this as well. What is intelligence for in Canada if not to protect Canadians? And part of that is warning them when they're targets of this kind of activity. The idea of public funding for political parties, I think, is really interesting from a national security perspective. I know that that's been talked about in more of the public policy space. And expanding funding for media, including local and foreign language media, was really a useful conversation to have. I don't know that it's going to get a lot of political play these days, but again, if we want to protect a lot of these institutions, these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And the last one that really struck me was the need for a declassification system. We all know that access to information in Canada is broken. And this is one of the most important things I think we can do to improve transparency, which is, again, one of those systemic issues that keeps coming up in our discussions of security intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I think I share your frustration. Whether or not you think this report was successful or not, I think really depended on what your priors were with regards to what you wanted to get out of it, right? I mean, it's very clear the media wants heads, right? They're in the business of wanting heads. They want to know who the responsible people are, who put us in this situation, and can we hold them accountable?
And they're
And I
really
think
sore that no one was called a traitor.
and are very sore that no one was called the traitor, but also that no one in government is at fault for doing this. And in fact, Og actually says, look, there are no bad guys here. That's not the word she used, but effectively she's saying that, look, there's no person out here that's out to undermine Canadian democracy. There's no one responsible person. This is systemic failure. And I think that was one of the things that you and I had probably said, this report is going to find systemic failure. That will be the finding of this report. You're not going to get the kind of heads that you're dealing with, because the intelligence policy problems in this country are systemic. They're not the fault of one individual, even if you could make the argument that ultimately the prime minister is responsible for these kinds of things.
I want to come back to that issue of misinformation and disinformation. And I think that you might have some interesting thoughts to share with us on that. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what your thinking was around that in foreign interference?
I was surprised, honestly, because so let's go back to the mandate of the commission. The mandate of the commission was to effectively look at the 2019, 2021 elections, and then determine whether or not they were free and fair, because that's where a lot of the reporting had been, and there was concern raised. And you gave that history earlier on. And so the issue about disinformation really didn't come up in the public hearings. It may have come up a little bit in some of the expert testimony. There was the media Ecosystem Observatory, which is based out of McGill. They do amazing work. Highly recommend checking them out if you have a chance. And I think that there may have been written submissions, and there was also, of course, a lot of testimony that we didn't get to see. A lot of it was behind the scenes. So as a result of that, I was somewhat surprised to see such a heavy emphasis on disinformation, to the point where she actually says the primary threat to Canadian democracy, not the primary foreign interference threat, but the primary threat to Canadian democracy is mis and disinformation.
And what do you think about that? Do you think that that's accurate?
I think it's not wrong. I don't know if I agree with that. I think you could very easily make the argument that this is the case, right? I mean, mis and disinformation right now is definitely the thing that is driving, I think, polarization in the country. That is ruining our social media. And this is a whole separate podcast that we should be having at some point about, the role of algorithms and how it kind of amplifies this content, which derives emotional reaction, right? And much of which is mis and disinformation. So I don't necessarily think it was wrong. I just didn't really see it as, I guess, part of the mandate. And so for her to kind of go in that direction to me was a bit of a surprise. Again, not a wrong thing, but the issue here is like she in diagnosing it as the primary threat, Justice doesn't have a lot to say on what we should do about it. Right. I think she then says, okay, well, we should just label content. Well, good luck with that right now. Right. That's just not something that I think is even feasible. So I think that, it's one thing to kind of make this as a point, but then, and make it as the central point, but it's a bit frustrating then not to really have any solutions. Now it's fair because this is one of the most complex problems that are facing not just our democracy, but all democracies. And I don't think anyone has a good handle on this yet, but it does kind of leave the report a little bit wanting in that respect. What's your take?
Yeah, I was really surprised by that as well. I know that I mentioned it very, very, very briefly during my roundtable, just from a financing perspective. But again, I wouldn't have said that it was one of the main things, and I really was surprised considering how much she tried to stick to her mandate in other ways. So, but yeah, there's a whole conversation to be had around mis and disinformation that maybe we need to have a whole episode on, or maybe a couple of episodes on.
Let me then ask you. Okay, so you've asked me about mis and disinformation. You testified about financial aspects, right? And one of the big issues that we have is like we just are not. You've built an entire business around the fact that we are bad at prosecuting financial crimes, including crimes related to national security. In my view, she didn't have a lot to say about that aspect of this, and so I'd be curious to know what your thoughts were on what you testified on.
Yeah, again, I think it comes down to that mandate issue. So a lot of the stuff that I was sharing at the roundtable was separate from federal elections. I definitely talked about some issues around, funding of political candidates at all levels of government, which again would be outside of the scope of the mandate of the inquiry because it was focused on federal elections. But I'm flagging that this happens at municipal and in Indigenous communities as well. So this is a really important thing. Um, so I think a lot of that stuff never made it into the report, but to a certain extent, a lot of it is just I see it as almost like like housekeeping, little things that we need to do to update our legislation. So, for instance, I recommended that the Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections become a disclosure recipient for FinTrack reporting, our financial intelligence unit. And they've actually already asked to become one. So I think the process is already underway. So it doesn't necessarily need to be its own recommendation. I also recommended that they expand politically exposed persons reporting. That didn't get any play in the report, but I think it's the kind of thing that can come through with regular updates to our Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act legislation, which happens every 5 years anyways. So there's a lot of stuff like that that government departments and agencies can pull from those roundtables that didn't necessarily have to be part of the recommendations itself.
Sorry,
But
just out of
really,
curiosity, just for my Oshawa brain, what when you say about the politically exposed persons, what would that do? Just
right.
quickly.
So politically exposed persons reporting in Canada requires that banks apply enhanced due diligence to people who are in a position of high political power. So if you're a deputy minister or a minister and you're banking, banks should pay more attention to the financial transactions that you're engaging in, mostly like targeting corruption and trying to catch early instances of corruption. But those rules really only apply at a very, very high level. They don't apply to lower levels of governments, provincial, municipal, and indigenous. And I think by expanding out that and having more due diligence on that, we'd be better able to capture, third party funding of candidates, maybe expanding politically exposed persons reporting to people who are involved in the political campaigns, because that's sort of the thing that we're seeing, right? It's not like it's foreign interference funding is not like India's consulate in Canada does not send money directly to a political party or to a political candidate. It's going through third parties, it's going through intermediaries. So we need to be more sensitive to how that happens. And that's just an example. It can happen from a whole bunch of different countries. Um, but we need to have a more expanded reporting mandate to be able to capture that.
And do you have any takes on the recommendations for the national security intelligence community, particularly CSIS? I don't think there was a lot in here for CSE in particular, but like CSIS, there were some recommendations. I found it interesting that she felt that CSIS did not do an appropriate job of flagging which reports were important, which weren't, which I understand at a very basic level. But I think my concern there is it's like, I think what is important is what's not. It's very, very hard for an organization to choose.
And
I mean, that's
profoundly
almost
subjective.
yeah, it's very subjective. And also it's going to be different depending on the topic, right? Like, and also issues of the day and what was report, if we just think about the speed of events right now, like what was important, or what's important right now, very, very different from what was important 2 weeks ago, for example. So I think that's a really hard thing to do. And I think maybe that is a job better left up to the client relations officers. Now, these are the officers who are usually CSIS intelligence officers, and they're embedded in other organizations. And it sounds like they've kind of improved those functions a little bit. There's now a CSIS, according to this report, there's now a CSIS person like literally sitting in Public Safety Canada, who's like, I think she used the word like curating intelligence reports and making sure they're getting to the right senior officials and ministers. Now, I think that's a much better approach than some kind of labeling system where, because it's not to get into too much inside baseball here, but like, with intelligence requirements, like, there's priority levels, but eventually everything becomes the highest priority, right? Because no one wants to lower a priority item and then have it kind of explode onto the scene. So I think I'm not sure how practical that recommendation is, but I think if the service itself could find ways to, flag things a little bit better and try to use the client relations officers to ensure that they're kind of being read, or like ensure maybe pointing out that, hey, this is something you should read, is kind of the way to go.
I have a slightly different perspective on that. I did 18 years in the Canadian government, most of it in security intelligence work. And it never ceased to amaze me how little senior leaders wanted to read intelligence. And I think that was so surprising because information is power in government. And
I
so
think that's changing though.
yeah,
I think I would say that 18 years, I think there's been a big change.
but clearly not enough, right? Because the point that I'm making here is that if intelligence were really seen as valuable, there would be much more pull on those client relations officers. There would almost not be a need for them because people would be seeking out that information much more actively. People would come into the office every morning and, okay, what's in the top of the box? What's the most important? This is where I'm going to start my day. And I don't get the impression that that's what's happening. There's a number of cultural and actually sometimes technological reasons for that.
Yeah, I think that technological thing is big,
Which is
right?
a whole, like, this is just a whole broader conversation still around intelligence culture and the prioritization of intelligence in Canada and how we don't do that very well. And so, like,
Yeah.
while we have had some improvements, I think these issues are still the persistent issues, and no amount of little fixes can make up for this pervasive lack of interest in intelligence at the highest levels.
Yeah,
So
it is, to be fair though, I would say, and we'll see how this works out, because inevitably there'll be another commission. We'll get an update in a couple of years. But
I think
what
we're
I
due
would
in 2 years, right?
yeah, exactly. I think we'll be due, right? Exactly. Mark your calendars, folks. But I think one of the things is that, and this is where I would actually be a little bit more optimistic if you look at the new deputy ministers committees, if you look at the new National Security Council of Cabinet, assuming that the next government does keep that going, which I would certainly hope. There does seem to be a much more concerted effort to get people to read these things. And one of the things we found, when Toma and I did our research in the community, is that people tended to read intelligence when they knew their boss was reading intelligence, right? So I think that you can set that example. And again, intelligence should not be the be all and end all of policy discussions and things like that. It is one factor that goes into it, but it needs to be a factor. And I think that's the point that we have been trying to make.
I completely agree with that. I worked in intelligence when Stephen Harper was prime minister, and he read intelligence.
Yes.
And you could see that because the demand for the same things that he was reading were very high. Everybody wanted to know what the prime minister was reading so that when he talked about it or when he was making decisions, they were informed as well. And I think so it really comes from the highest levels.
I agree.
And the last thing that I'll say on that, though, is that, and this is part of the recommendations in the OG report, was our intelligence agencies need to do a better job of writing.
Yeah.
They need to be much more strategic, use much more clear language. And that's difficult. I know that work is really hard.
It is, but it's your job.
It is your job.
You have one job, is to communicate information. And I would agree with that. I mean, having seen some of the briefing notes that were released, I was shocked. Honestly, like bottom line up front, just completely buried. Just really odd language in some of these briefing notes that, and I mean, to be fair, these briefing notes were not, these were talking points that were supposed to be used in meetings. I don't think these were actually ever handed to anyone. But like lines like, countries won't take us seriously until we do a better job on foreign interference. I'm sorry, that's not an intelligence assessment. That's a political statement. That is not okay, right? And I was kind of surprised to actually see that in these kinds of notes. And yeah, I mean, there is the point that other countries will learn lessons from our experience and things like this, but that was a really odd thing. But yeah, doing better to communicate this. But Jess, this brings me to my other really big point about what I think this report missed, and that is the capacity of the government to respond to the threat of foreign interference. And that this really is something that I was really disappointed in. I thought there was going to be a lot more on the ability of the community to respond. In fact, there's a line she gives, which is like, I've looked at the resources that the intelligence community has, and they can do the job. And my jaw hit the floor. I don't think I could be in any more radical disagreement. And to your point about we have studied these issues time and time again and found very similar results. I mean, there's been 10 reports on problems with the RCMP. Like 10 reports on just how broken that system is. And, I mean, I tried to cite it in my testimony. I tried to talk about how the problem, and she's like, yeah, we need better training for the RCMP and things like that. No, I mean, the system doesn't work. Like, it's not working. And what's happening right now, we're taking the RCMP from foreign interference, which we said, oh, look, the RCMP is going to go on, going to fix this foreign interference problem. And now we're taking all those officers we were going to put on foreign interference and we're sticking them at the border because we have a tariff crisis. And, so like, to me, this was just an absolutely baseless conclusion. And the other thing is, if she did actually study the resources of the community, it does not show in this report, right? She did not do any work. To me, it doesn't seem like she was curious as to whether or not the community could actually do the work that it's supposed to do. And that, to me, maybe that's because some of the media lines were driving the lines of inquiry. Who knew what when? Who knew what when is not about capacity to respond, right? It can lead us to some studying that. But I mean, honestly, and this isn't an argument for dumping money on the RCMP. If anything, I would suggest the opposite. I would say that, we need to fundamentally rethink the way that we're doing this. We need to do a huge change in our culture around these issues. And, just, putting, a bunch of RCMP officers on a 2-week course on trying to understand the Chinese community in Canada, that ain't it. Right? That ain't it. That's not going to fix this. This was this was to me the biggest miss of this report. And I don't know why more work on this wasn't being done, because to me, understanding the capacity of the system is far more important than to the initial questions of 2019 and 2021 than even perhaps the disinformation question, which she spent a lot of time on.
Yeah, the RCMP question is one that came up in your testimony. I think it came up in mine, Mike Nesbitt's, Bob Paulson, a few other people's testimony, or at least participation in the roundtables. That came up a number of times. And I think you're right. Like the tradition in Canada in the RCMP in terms of resourcing, particularly in the federal policing space, is to rob Peter to pay Paul. So we're constantly moving resources from one priority to another because we just don't have capacity. We don't have, force generation capabilities within the RCMP and even ability to protect that expertise. I do have a one follow-up question for you on that, though. In terms of the resources, because my understanding was that a number of our security and intelligence organizations in Canada were having a really hard time staffing and had a lot of vacancies. So is that your understanding as well? And so it's funny
Yeah,
to me that that wasn't mentioned.
no, that's true, right? And even the service has had a huge, a number of people have left that organization. I mean, there's a lot of problems at the service, well documented in the media. You can go Google that. And the problem is when you replace someone like that, it takes up to 18 months. You can't just hire someone the next day. You can't go to one of these job sites and just hire someone off the street. Like it takes a long time to bring someone in the building. Even if someone has a top secret clearance at, say, Global Affairs Canada, that's not sufficient to work. You basically are starting that process over from scratch. So it's long and it's expensive. So yeah, CSIS definitely has a lot of vacancies. The RCMP has a pretty substantial vacancy rate. I think it's like it can be as high as 30% in some areas of the country. That's very rare, but but almost every RCMP detachment provincially has vacancy rates, and at the federal mandate level. So of course, like there's the contract policing with the provinces, and then there's the overarching federal responsibilities, which is where foreign interference lies. There's more vacancies. It's a higher percentage because most of the RCMP officers, as I understand it, they prefer to work in the provinces because there's more chances for promotion. Chances are you can maybe work more locally. And I think to a certain extent you may even be paid better. So I think that these are the kinds of things that have continuously driven this problem. And again, I think this is even worth another episode in and of itself, right? And maybe we can find a better expert to talk about these things. But all this to say, like, I mean, look, this isn't necessarily to shade any particular person in the RCMP or anything like that, but structurally, there's huge capability gaps here. I mean, this is not a problem you're going to solve by throwing money at. This is a problem you're going to have to solve by kind of restructuring that entire system. And it's unfortunate that Justice Ogue chose not to maybe give her views on that question.
So I was really struck by the whole conversation around the NSICOP report. So this was National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report on foreign interference. The unclassified version was tabled on the 3rd of June in 2024. And what Justice Ogue says about the report is that some of the findings were more definitive than underlying intelligence could support. They also contained inaccuracies, either in the way that intelligence was described or in the intelligence itself. And I'm going to quote Commissioner Ogue here because I think it's really important to understand the implications of this report and the NSICOP report. These assertions had the perhaps unintended effect of causing widespread public consternation, casting a cloud of suspicion over all parliamentarians, especially those from diverse backgrounds, and contributing to the erosion of Canadians' trust in their democratic institutions. So to me, the NSICOP report demonstrates the implications of what happens at the highest levels when intelligence analysis goes a little sideways. Like these are serious implications from one report.
So to that point, I have a couple of takes on this. The first is that I don't think NSICOP realized the intelligence was wrong. I don't think CSIS realized the intelligence was wrong. And this is why intelligence isn't evidence. This is why you just don't read out a list of names in Parliament, right? Because it turned out in some cases the underlying intelligence was not accurate. And that didn't come out until the fall hearings. And then they could make a determination that actually, no, some of this was incorrect. No, so I don't think there's any ill will here. I don't think people were trying to take the intelligence and torque it in any particular way. It's just the intelligence was wrong, as what happens with intelligence. This is why we don't take CSIS reports and bring them to court and say, yes, this definitely happened. And I think that's a really important context to make. Where I'm frustrated with this, and I don't know if this would have been appropriate for Justice Ogue to comment on, is the government had this NSICOP report for months prior to its release. Why didn't it issue a response? And I don't understand why it didn't issue a response. Now you could make the argument that it didn't want to look like it was like countering the MPs, that it would look too defensive and things like this. But I think it should have said, as all these officials later did on the stand, they said, look, the intelligence here, there's some questions here. We disagree with the assessment. The language is too strong. These would have been things that you should have released when the report was released, right? Have this counter argument. And I think maybe it would have caused a bit of a political fracas, but I think at the same time, they should have responded to this report. And I think the government's failure to release this report or any kind of response allowed certain myths to go ahead. The idea that there were these 6 traitors in parliament and things like this. Even just saying, look, we're not saying that there isn't problems here, that there isn't ethical issues or conflict of interest or people shouldn't have known better. We agree with that, but the idea that this is like treason is wrong. And I think that would have been something that should have come out in some kind of government response. So I actually put the blame on this for the, I don't know if it's PCO, PMO, or the prime minister or whatever, but not having coordinated a response to that NSICOP report definitely, I think, contributed to a lot of suspicion that just did not need to be there.
When I read Justice Oak's comments around this, there's a number of places my head went to, and some of them reflect what you've already talked about. You and I know what happens in on the inside. Intelligence gets retracted because sometimes it's wrong. Stuff gets clarified all the time. Stuff gets contextualized. So, if you're something that you read 6 months ago, there might be 6 months worth of reporting that adds context and clarification to what was initially a very alarming statement or report. And so it does always have that sort of element of it, the refinement of the analytic judgments. But I still have follow-up questions for NSICOP about their internal processes, analytic expertise, and the judgment that went into some of this report, because it was made public. It was a public-facing report. And so, if I was in charge over there, and I'm not, so everybody can be happy about this, I would certainly be doing a lessons learned to make sure that all of those pieces are in place, and that I don't want to say mistakes because that's too strong, but
how this ended up being as strong as it was.
yeah,
It's always a good, like, what they got right, what they got wrong. That's always a good thing to do regardless.
exactly.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I pulled up NSICOP's departmental performance report because I'm like, oh, how many people work there? And it actually turns out there's only 8.5 people who actually are on the secretariat, so the people who would be doing the work. And it's meant to be 10. So, they're down a person and a half. So again, like a little bit on the resourcing side. So, I think that there's some lessons to be learned here as well. The best outcome, of course, might be that everything went well and there was just some, the
Like,
context.
if the intelligence is flawed and you go with that, then
But even then, I would say that there's maybe some lessons to be learned about sourcing and checking before that information becomes public, because those were some pretty alarming statements in that report.
I think one of the issues is that the review bodies themselves, they don't have access to who the human sources are. Right. One of the things we did typically when we wrote assessments is, you would then send it back to the desk and you're like, oh, no, you interpreted that wrong because we know who this source is. And yeah, they didn't quite mean it in that way. And then you're like, oh, okay, you would change it in the report. So it's not clear to me if they just were looking at raw reporting, all these different kinds of things. I don't know. And so I think that this is where, yeah, they're going to want to be more careful in the long run. But again, they don't have a lot of access to who these humans, so for good reason, they don't have access to who the human sources are and things like that. But yeah, maybe this is something that needs to be a little bit more carefully needs to be done in the future.
There was one recommendation that I really wanted to get your take on, particularly because I know you've done work on it sort of in a different context. The report recommends warning the public through the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol and Panel of 5 about foreign interference during federal elections. And I want to hear from you what we can learn from terrorism threat warnings about this idea, and like if this could
Oh
actually
boy.
work.
That is a great question, because I could see this going the NSICOP report route where it's basically days and days and days of coverage of, oh my gosh, there's traitors in the midst. And on the other hand, I could definitely see it just kind of with terrorism warnings. The research suggests that when you give a terrorism warning, it lasts for 3 days max, right? Like, people go on with their lives. And I think this is the other thing too. It's like, yes, there is foreign interference. And it is a little bit more broad because of the digital age, and messages can spread across the country and things like that. I don't want to downplay this. But like, the threat in Toronto is going to be different from the threat in Flin Flon, Newfoundland. Right. I mean, that is just also the reality. So this is the problem with this kind of threat reporting anyways. It doesn't make a lot of sense, I think. And the other thing I would worry about is, if you're going to issue a statement, make it specific, right? Make it specific. There's going to be a lot of tension there because you don't want to be too specific, because maybe there's still ongoing investigations and you don't want to tip people off. But on the other hand, if it's just this vague warning of, yeah, be careful of foreign interference, kids, I mean, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. Like, it's going to be useful. I don't know what your thought on this.
Oh, I think your example of the threat warning and the terrorism context being different in Flin Flon as it is in Toronto is really apt here, because we see foreign interference targeting electoral districts. So specific areas, right? Like, it's not necessarily foreign interference. Sometimes it's foreign interference writ large, but it's often very specific, like ridings that are being targeted by threat actors. And so the same thing applies in this case. The threat environment in Toronto is not the same thing as it is in Gander, from a foreign interference perspective. So I think there's some really important lessons to be learned there.
Yeah, I would agree. And like, as a final thing, I would just say I could see such a warning actually having a useful disruptive effect, right? I can definitely see that, but that has to be really carefully calibrated. And again, especially if you're trying to prosecute people for this stuff under our new charge legislation that came out last summer, then you're going to want to be really, really careful on how this goes. I can see this going all kinds of bad. So then speaking of all kinds of bad, what did we learn here? What like, let's do our final takeaways maybe, because we could probably go on about this for like an entire season. So what did we learn here?
I'm going to be really cynical here and say I didn't learn a lot. I learned that this was a really expensive process for confirming the stuff that we already knew was happening in the security and intelligence community in Canada. I will, though, say that I think this had a really profound public education component to it. I think you mentioned something around that earlier. And I think that this has advanced the conversation around security and intelligence in Canada, mostly in a positive direction. But, we didn't really actually need this inquiry to understand the foreign interference threat to this extent. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, she kind of suggests that as well when she says of the NSICOP report. I mean, by she, I mean, of course, Justice O. She says nothing in the NSICOP report should have surprised Canadians. And here we were having just a complete breakdown as we were. So I don't know. I think to a certain extent, we can definitely, like, the problem with the Johnson process is that it really was not transparent. I don't think it was sufficiently transparent. We did have the reports from NSICOP and NCIRA that came out subsequently, but that was as the commission was doing its work. So I think it's hard to necessarily evaluate this in retrospect. But to your point, I think this report it's going to be a Rorschach test, right? I've already seen people say, "Oh, look, no traitors. This was totally useless. It was a witch hunt." At the end. And then I've seen people saying, "Oh, this is the deep state protecting itself. It's just, it's all bad," and things like that, and kind of and doing that. And I think that's the problem with this report, right? It was never really going to make anyone happy. I think the commission, to its credit, did the best it could in a year. I've criticized it for the gap around capacity, but the reality is like, the Arar inquiry was much, much longer, right? On a much more narrow, specific issue. This was like 15 months, but really the work only started, I think, in January of 2024. And to that end, they had to put all of this together. And for that, I get it. The question is, it's like, what do we get out of these commissions? I mean, I think, I was talking to one of our colleagues who was scheduled to do some interviews about this, and the next day after it's released, and they canceled it because everything has moved on. I worry that we do these exercises. There are some useful suggestions out of them, but we're not seeming to get anything out of them, right? Like, what are we getting? Like, if the one that really breaks my heart is the one that comes out of Nova Scotia about the mass shooting there, and all of the problems with the police and the RCMP, and nothing really seems to have come out of that. And this is not a good, if governments aren't going to take the lessons of these seriously. I mean, yes, it's good as an education exercise, as a transparency exercise, but that's how we have to start understanding these things, because I'm not sure that the recommendations themselves are being acted on. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I look back on the last few commissions that we've seen, the mass casualty event in Nova Scotia specifically, and then also the Cullen Commission out from BC, and the number of recommendations that just have not been implemented or that all levels of government are dragging their feet on, I think is a really lengthy list at this point.
I feel like it's kind of a, I said, what did we learn here? It was my subtle reference to burn after reading. And I kind of feel like maybe we're in a burn after reading situation here, right? And I think that this is, if we're going to have these inquiries, it really would be great if the media itself will continue to apply pressure on governments to implement some of these recommendations. But that's just not the media ecosystem that we live in these days. So I don't know, maybe in our scholarly research, we can continue to bang the drum for reform, for better performance and things like that. But
now we have a whole podcast we can do it on too.
We have a whole podcast we can do it on, Jess. And that's probably the way of the future.
Perfect. I want to end this podcast with our theme for this year, our first season of Secure Line, and ask you a broad question about foreign interference and Trump.
Oh,
is there a nexus here, or is this something to be concerned about? What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a good question. So a lot of people ask, let's start with the convoy, right? I remember being asked by reporters, just saying, is this foreign interference, the convoy? And I said, no, because it's not clandestine, right? It's not clandestine.
Exactly. It's overt.
Right? Yeah, it's very obvious. I think where the foreign interference threat comes is actually through the media ecosystem around Trump, which we know is being targeted by foreign actors. And the most egregious case that we know of is Tenet Media, which was actually a Canadian company that was basically taking money from Russia and paying mostly American podcasters, but some Canadian podcasters to produce content that was very similar to that which supports kind of Russian narratives and MAGA narratives and things like this. And so I think that's where the foreign interference and Trump angle probably lies, is that whole media ecosystem around him. And I think the other thing would be the podcasters, so like Andrew Schultz, Joe Rogan, like all those kind of podcasters who are, they are kind of adopting some of these lines through this kind of pervasive ecosystem of ideas. But that's a very hard kind of threat to counter, right? And so I think this is where she gets to the point about misinformation and disinformation being the priority threat. But it's not Trump himself, it's not tariffs, it's not things like that, it's not clandestine behavior. So I don't think we can categorize it in it's unpleasant, but it doesn't mean it's foreign interference.
That's great. And thank you for remembering about Tenet Media, because I had completely forgotten about that. How is it possible that I've forgotten about that? I did like a whole thing on it. That's exactly, I just want to emphasize that point, right? The foreign influence, the overt foreign influence coming from the United States is not a problem. Well, you could probably talk about it as being a problem, but it's not a security and intelligence issue from that perspective. It doesn't meet the threshold of foreign interference. But Russians paying covertly for podcasters to amplify particular narratives, that is foreign interference. And that's a thing that's still happening, that has happened recently in Canada, and that we've seen no real action on.
Well, on that happy note, no treason, bad behavior.
No traitors in Parliament.
Yep. And I think we should call it a day. And I'm sure the themes of this podcast, the themes of this report are going to continue to be on our podcast. So hopefully this was interesting for the listeners, and be sure to rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast outlet.